Welcome to the fifth episode of our new series called The New World Order, or perhaps it should be called The New World Disorder. Essentially, it's a rundown of the different chapters of my book, which has the working title The Global West versus the Global East, or How the Global South is going to decide the New World Disorder. And you will have seen and heard from the previous episodes that the book has a preface, introduction, then 3 parts with a grand total of 9 chapters, and then a conclusion. Today we are still in part 1, the order of power. And today we will focus on multilateral institutions in this system of order, because I think they are, of course, the key. And I call this chapter Multilateral Disorder. And today, again, I'll go through 6 parts of the chapter. I'll begin it with reading out the prescript and then finish it by reading out the postscript. So this is how I kick off the chapter. End of September 2008. World leaders are gathered in New York for the United Nations Annual General Assembly. Lehman Brothers has just collapsed. Markets are in turmoil. I'm Foreign Minister of Finland and Chairman of the OSCE, fresh out of mediating a ceasefire in the short war between Russia and Georgia. Feeling jet-lagged, tired. My calendar is full of 15-minute bilateral meetings. Many colleagues want to get my take on the frozen conflicts in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. I want to lobby them because Finland is aiming to get the rotating seat in the UN Security Council. Next up, EU ministerial lunch with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. He comes in late, takes the microphone, starts rambling about Georgia, how Georgia attacked first. We all know he's lying. My colleagues are rolling their eyes. Here we go again. Multilateral diplomacy can be frustrating and tedious at times. At the same time, I'm fully aware that this is probably the best, if not the only, way to keep the dialogue going. We need a multilateral, rules-based world order, no matter how messy it often is. So the chapter begins with an experience from a multilateral context. And it does have 6 parts. The first part talks about multilateral indigestion. And of course, the argument here being that multilateralism and multilateral institutions are an essential part of the liberal world order. I personally love international gatherings, and of course you can look at them from so many different angles. And we made a calculation together with my research assistant, Jonas Brendenbach, that there are over 50,000 government and non-government organizations, institutions, networks, and fora for international cooperation. I actually start the chapter with a little description of the classic World Economic Forum meeting up in the hills of Davos as an international fora. So there are many, many ways in which human beings around the world get together to talk about international affairs and common problems. And they do so in over 50,000 organizations. So there is a little bit of, how would I say, international or multilateral indigestion. Now, point number 2 in this chapter is to say that, there is sort of one organization which is still the backbone of the world order, and that is, of course, the United Nations, which was founded in April 1945 in San Francisco and actually had 50 signing states to start off with. Now, the UN, you might have so many opinions about its successes and failures, etc. But it does have one goal above everything else, and that is to maintain peace. So if you want to use a cliche, it is the organization of peace, the one that tries to maintain both peace and security, and of course then stability as well. Sometimes successfully, at other times not. The Security Council, which is kind of the key body of the UN, contains, as you all know, 5 states. 3 of them come from the global West and 2 from the global East. The 3 from the global West are the United States, France and the United Kingdom as victors of World War II, and then of course Russia and China. All of these countries do have one other thing in common, and that is that they are nuclear powers. The UN Security Council has the monopoly on the use of force in international law. Now, of course, you can say that, for instance, in the war in Ukraine, the UN Security Council has failed because one of its members, Russia, is by definition the aggressor that has violated all the rules of the UN charters linked to territorial integrity and national sovereignty, and that is certainly the case. I do, however, want to defend the UN in the sense that it's still the main body where we can have this conversation in a structured way, including all of the frustrations that it entails. And I should also say that, you know, the political arm of the UN is in New York, but some people say that the brains are elsewhere, like in Geneva, because the UN, of course, has 30 different types of agencies. I mean, 13, specific ones, but 30 if you sort of look at all different aspects. And the key ones, of course, still work quite well. You know, there's a food agency, FAO. There is the one dealing with labor, ILO. You've all heard of UNICEF, UNESCO, the IMF, and of course, during the pandemic, the WHO. So, you know, the UN is a place where countries, states, it does have 193 of them, get together to discuss common problems and should be given credit for that. Of course, a lot of people criticize the UN for inefficiency or that encroaches on sovereignty and that it's not fair. And you can have those conversations. And in many ways, the UN has been quite slow and actually conservative in driving institutional change. We'll have these conversations, for instance, linked to the UN Security Council. I mean, why is India not represented there? Why is Latin America? Why is Africa out of the UN Security Council? So a lot of things that we can talk about. Now, the third point in the chapter is that, after the Cold War ended, remember the bipolar world became and had its sort of what was called the unipolar moment, we did lose an opportunity because at the end of the Cold War, there was this sentiment that, okay, the Cold War is over, let's try to solve global problems. And there was a moment when things were looking quite good. The horrible attack of when Saddam Hussein and Iraq attacked Kuwait, there was unanimity in the UN Security Council to condemn it. Quite rare, but it was there. I also remember watching, as a young student at Furman University in South Carolina, I remember watching George Bush, the older, give a speech about the new world order, how we would come together, how we would bury the war hatchets and ideological hatchets of the Cold War. But unfortunately, it didn't work out. I mean, there was an attempt to revitalize and renew international institutions, multilateral institutions. In Europe, the OSSE, through the Paris Accords, became the OSCE. NATO, of course, expanded. The EU expanded. The GATT became the WTO. But as you can see, a lot of these were sort of touch-ups of the Western international order. And of course, the West had won the Cold War, hands down. So one could understand that. In the UN, it was exciting times as well. Went up to over 190 members. There were 20 peacekeeping missions from 1989 to 1994, and up to that date there had only been 15. And still this was called the unipolar moment. And there was still some frustration. Now, I finish the chapter by saying that there were three trends that made things in world politics and multilateral institutions rather complicated. The first one is the multiplication of institutions, players and fora. The second one becomes the regionalization of multilateralism. And the third one becomes distrust in the international system. So let me dissect these to finish off. Number one, the multiplication of the players and fora. Now, let's begin by looking at some figures. In the early 1990s, there were about 16,000 non-governmental organizations globally. In 2017, there were 26,000. So that's 10,000 more in less than 30 years. Now, a lot of them were trying to deal with transnational issues and global public goods, and of course always meant well, but it becomes this sort of cacophony. I'm not saying it needs to be controlled, but the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. Now, these were all sort of formal places to have conversations, but they were also informal fora, which to me were an indication that something in the big scheme didn't work, like the UN, for instance. So in the global south, there was a G77, which always met on the UN sidelines. They were called developing countries. There was, of course, the traditional non-aligned movement, NAM, which had over 120 members. G7, much smaller, which were rich industrial countries. G20, which then brought in some of the global west, global east, and global south. Again, big economies. BRICS became coined actually by a Goldman Sachs economist in the form of Jim O'Neill. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, many others. So there was also the Middle East Quartet. So you have a lot of these sort of informal organizations trying to take the space in the multilateral system. I'm not saying it's wrong, it's a reality, but they certainly don't work in a consistent kind of a way in a rules-based system. They're informal. Now, the second thing that I found to be a problem in sort of multilateral development in the post-Cold War era was the regionalization of cooperation. And I'll come back to this theme towards the conclusion of the book, because one of the big theses that we're dealing with in the book is to say that we're not necessarily witnessing a fully scaled deglobalization of the world, but actually tighter regionalization of globalization. And of course the EU is the main example here, right? And I do go back to a really classic book, the first book I got on Amazon in the 1990s when I was working on my PhD, a used book. Ernst B. Haas wrote a classic on the uniting of Europe and basically making an argument that there are a lot of regional integration that's going to start taking place around the world. And to a certain extent, he was right. Not obviously to the levels and depth of pooling of sovereignty that the European Union has done, but if you look at what kind of regional cooperation we've seen since 1945, when World War II ended, there are roughly 80 different types of regional intergovernmental organizations with various levels of integration. The ASEAN was created in Asia in 1967. In 1969, the Andean Pact in Latin America. In 1975, ECOWAS in Africa. In the 1990s, Mercosur, again in Latin America. Then, of course, NAFTA as well, between Canada, the US, and Mexico. A lot of polemic around that. APEC, then OAS, the Organization of Americas. Now, a lot of times these organizations, which are more formal than the ones I mentioned earlier, G7, G77, G20, they are based on economic and sort of functional cooperation to different degrees. And I actually think they're quite good from a regional perspective. We'll continue to see them. Russia created the Eurasian Economic Union, EAEU, with a lot of Eurasian countries and of course the classic stands in the form of Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, etc. There's also the SCO, Shanghai Cooperation, led by China. So, a lot of different forms of cooperation taking place. So the argument here is that multilateralism on a global level, mainly in the form of the UN, is actually weakened by these regional structures. Now, the question, of course, that we should pose ourselves is that, should these regional organizations be so tightly knit that they could actually be represented in the United Nations? I leave that open for now. The third and final point, and the sixth point in the chapter, is to say that one of the big problems we have right now is a certain loss of trust in the international order. And if there's something that keeps the international order, or actually society, together, it is trust. And when you lose that trust, which takes a long time to build, it takes then a very long time to get it back. There are many who have this sort of lack of agency in the system, so they don't feel that they're strongly enough represented. And I think many of them are actually right. The international order, and sorry to all of my friends from the Global West, has been created in the image of the Global West. I'm not saying that it's wrong. I like the value base of it. I like the rules based of it. And I'd like to maintain it. But, if we want to maintain it, there needs to be agency from other players. The UN Security Council, which I mentioned earlier, is a good example. The WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, etc. So there are three issues linked to this losing of trust. The first one is this sort of perception and reality gap. So the question that a lot of people pose is that, does the international multilateral system serve everyone? And the answer is that selectively, yes. It tries to serve everyone, but it kind of fails. The second problem that we have, I think, are what I call inconsistent instruments. So it means that sometimes when there's a crisis, a lot of people feel left out. So when there's a financial crisis, who do you bail out? Well, you bail out Western banks and Western countries, but you kind of leave a lot of countries in the global south and some in the global east out in the cold. Is this value-based? No. Is it interest-driven? Yes, it probably is. But this leaves a perception of inconsistent instruments. And of course, vaccine distribution is a good example of that. I mean, my good friend who runs the biggest think tank in India, ORF, his name is Samir Saran, he always says that, it's not the war in Ukraine that changed the perception, it was actually vaccine distribution, which ended up being, I'm using a strong term here, but very Darwinistic in the sense that it was the ones that were able to develop the vaccines and have the money for it that kept them to themselves and weren't distributing strongly enough. In some cases, wrong accusations, but in many, correct ones. It leaves this sort of idea of inconsistent instruments. And the final problem of losing trust in the international order is sort of general populism. And here I think populism is kind of a problem for all of us. It's remember all of these big demonstrations against trade liberalization all around the world, against globalization, all of these hooded people burning things outside of WTO meetings. I've been involved in a few of them, not with the hood, I may add, on the other side of the fence, saying that globalization is bad, it's unfair, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, inside there's this sort of populism, both left and right, that needs to be dealt with in democracies and elsewhere, where people are trying to find simple solutions to complicated problems. And a lot of times the target is globalization or things international or things that we don't understand. So you end up losing trust in the international order and you turn very much inwards, I think, for three reasons. One is the perception and reality gap. Second is inconsistent instruments. And the third one is general populism. So this is what I deal with in this chapter on the multilateral disorder. And the reason I do it is that I really believe that if we want to get back on track, these institutions need to develop, they need to reform, to give more agency, because otherwise we get into this world, which we kind of already are in, which is not orderly at all. There's complete disorder and sort of competing institutions trying to fill the power vacuums. And my postscript for this chapter, I'll finish off with this, is the following. When I was in government, my advisors always insisted that I should go to Davos, because I often came back full of energy and new ideas, some of them naturally to the detriment of my advisors. Yes, even politicians need time to reflect. I often wonder why I was not able to see earlier the slow deterioration of the liberal, rules-based world order and the multilateral institutions that supported it. After all, it was happening right in front of my eyes. Perhaps I did not stop to reflect often enough, or perhaps I was blinded by my strong belief in the benefits of the system, or just too involved in order to understand what was happening. Most diplomatic meetings are, well, diplomatic, and thus leave a feeling that everything is more or less fine. Reality is naturally more complex. International relations is essentially about coordinating diverging interests, trying to find common solutions to common problems, or sometimes just agreeing to disagree without the disagreement escalating into conflict. So, sometimes the world moves from order to disorder without anyone really understanding why it's happening. When it's happening, it's often good to stop, take a deep breath, and reflect on how to get things back on track. And of course, that is what I intend to do in the third part of the book, which deals with the balance of order between the global West, the global East, and the global South. Until then, thanks for listening so far.